The wind had a name in the New Mexico Territory of 1886. It was a patient predator, a sculptor of stone and spirit, and tonight it stalked Pinyon Ridge with a low, mournful howl. It carried the fine, red dust of a thirsty land, sifting it through the sparse junipers and across the single, rutted track that served as the main street of Mesquite Crossing. The dust settled on everything, the warped timbers of the storefronts, the sagging canvas of a freighter's wagon, and the sweat-slicked hides of the 6 exhausted horses that pulled the stagecoach to a groaning halt before the swinging doors of the Dry Gulch Saloon. When the coach door creaked open, it was not a weary prospector or a flamboyant gambler who emerged, but a silhouette of quiet defiance against the saloon's jaundiced lamplight. Sable Hart stepped down onto the hardpan earth, her movements measured and deliberate, as if she were planting her feet in soil she already claimed. The dust immediately settled onto the hem of her dark traveling skirt, but she paid it no mind. Her hair was the color of a moonless night, pulled back in a practical knot from which a few rebellious strands whipped across her face in the incessant wind. But it was her eyes that held the territory's vastness bright, clear, and the deep gray of a coming storm. In one hand, she clutched the handle of a worn valise. In the other, held close to her side like a shield, was a long, cylindrical leather tube, sealed at both ends with polished brass caps. Inside it lay her only inheritance, her only weapon, the deed to a patch of land, and, more importantly, the water that bubbled up from it, a place called Coyote Draw Spring, a legacy from an aunt she'd barely known, a woman whose letters had spoken of betrayal and a debt of honor left unpaid. The moment Sable pushed through the saloon doors, the low drone of conversation faltered. A fiddle player, perched on a precarious stool in the corner, sawed his bow across the strings into an awkward silence. Mesquite Crossing was a place of hard men and harder realities, and a woman traveling alone, carrying herself with such resolute purpose, was a disruption to the natural order. The air, thick with the smell of stale whiskey, sweat, and cheap cigar smoke, seemed to grow heavier, charged with unspoken questions. Every eye was on her, but one pair watched with a stillness that set them apart. In the darkest corner of the room, at a small table isolated by choice, sat Rowan Creed. He was a man who seemed carved from the very rock of Pinyon Ridge, all hard lines and weathered surfaces. His face was a map of sun and shadow, creased at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into the horizon. He was known not as a rancher, for his spread was too modest, nor as a cowboy, for he rode for no brand but his own. They called him the Pinyon Ridge Solitary, a man who spoke little and sought no company. The war had left its brand on him, a quietness in his soul that kept the world at arm's length. He nursed a glass of whiskey, his gaze distant, but it sharpened with an unconscious focus as Sable Hart walked to the bar, her back straight as a rifle barrel. He saw the tremor in her hand as she placed the leather tube on the scarred wood, a flicker of vulnerability she thought she'd hidden from the world. The whispers in the saloon had been circling for weeks, like buzzards over a dying calf. Silas Crowley, a man whose ambition was as vast and unforgiving as the desert itself, was squeezing the life out of the valley. He had started with land, then moved to cattle, and now he was after the one thing no one could live without: water. One by one, the small springs and seeps were falling under his control, their deeds acquired through threats, foreclosures, or outright swindles. Crowley wasn't just building a cattle empire, he was forging a kingdom, and the ranchers of Mesquite Crossing were to be his subjects or his exiles, as if summoned by the tension his name had created. Silas Crowley himself rose from a larger table where he'd been holding court. He was a big man, not with the solid muscle of a laborer, but with the fleshy bulk of a man grown soft on the profits of others' sweat. A diamond stick-pin glittered in his cravat, and a smug, proprietary smile was fixed on his face. He moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of a wolf who knows the herd has nowhere to run. He stopped beside Sable, his shadow falling over her. Two of his men, Vern Locke and a hulking man known only as Pike flanked him like a pair of ill-tempered hounds. "Well now," Crowley's voice was a low, oily drawl that coated the room. "What have we here, little lost lamb? Far from the fold." Sable didn't turn to face him immediately. She addressed the bartender, her voice steady and clear. "A room for the night, please. And stabling for the stage driver's horses. I'll be claiming my own mount in the morning." Crowley chuckled, a sound like gravel rolling downhill. "Busy woman. What's in the tube? A love letter from back east." With a flick of his wrist, he sent Vern Locke forward. Vern's hands shot out, not to take the tube, but to deliberately knock it from the bar. It landed on the sawdust-covered floor with a dull thud. The brass caps gleamed under the lamplight. Sable froze, her jaw tightening. She bent slowly, her movement stiff with indignation, and retrieved the tube. When she straightened, she finally turned to face him, her gray eyes flashing. Crowley's smile widened. "Let's have a look at that. Property matters in this valley are my concern." Before she could react, he snatched the tube from her hand, twisted off the cap, and slid the rolled parchment out. He unrolled it with a theatrical flourish, his eyes scanning the elegant, spidery script of a bygone era. "Coyote drawspring," he read aloud, then snorted in derision. He held it up for the room to see, though none could read it from a distance. "This is a relic, an antique. It's got a county seal on it. I'll grant you that. But look here." He tapped a blank space on the document with a thick finger. "There's no stamp from a modern surveyor. Without a fresh survey. Registered and stamped. This piece of paper ain't worth the spit to paste it on a wall. It's invalid." He tossed the deed onto the bar, where it lay curled and vulnerable. A few of his cronies laughed. The rest of the room remained silent, a gallery of wary, sun-beaten faces watching the drama unfold. From his corner, Rowan Creed watched Sable. He saw the slight flare of her nostrils, the tightening of her grip on her valise. He saw the fear she was trying to master, the raw courage of a cornered animal. Sable's chin lifted. She looked directly into Crowley's condescending eyes, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised everyone, including herself. "I have the original plat maps that were filed with this deed, and a surveyor is on his way." The words hung in the air, a clear and unexpected challenge. A knot of hope tightened in the chests of some of the silent onlookers. But inside, Sable's heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had the maps. That was true, but the surveyor was a desperate bluff, a prayer sent into the unforgiving desert night. Crowley merely laughed, a booming, dismissive sound. A surveyor. And who might that be? Every licensed surveyor in this territory knows which side his bread is buttered on. And it ain't yours. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried through the silent room. "You've got nothing, girl. Go back where you came from before you get hurt." He turned and strode back to his table, leaving Vern and Pike to loom over her. Vern leaned over the bar, his breath smelling of cheap liquor. "The boss is right. Now, about that horse you mentioned. Seems a shame to leave a fine animal unattended. We'll see it's taken care of. Permanently." That was the final straw. This wasn't just about land or paper anymore. It was about possession, about stripping her of everything until she had no choice but to flee. Sable's gaze darted around the room, searching for an ally, a flicker of support. She found only downcast eyes and men suddenly fascinated by their whiskey glasses. Except for one. Her eyes met Rowan Creed's across the shadowed room. He held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, he lifted his chin slightly, a signal aimed not at her, but at the bartender. The old man, who had been nervously polishing a glass, understood immediately. He reached up and, with a puff of breath, extinguished the main lantern hanging over the bar. The saloon was plunged into near darkness, the only light coming from a single grimy lamp in the far corner and the pale moonlight filtering through the dusty windows. In the sudden confusion, a chair scraped against the floor. Rowan Creed was on his feet, moving with a silent, fluid grace that belied his quiet demeanor. He wasn't a large man, not like Crowley, but he moved with the coiled efficiency of a predator. He slipped past the bar and out the swinging doors before Vern or Pike even realized what was happening. They followed him out, grumbling and cursing, into the dusty street. Sable rushed to the doorway, her heart in her throat. The moon cast long, distorted shadows across the yard. Two more of Crowley's men were there, already untying the reins of the lead horse from the hitching post. They turned as Rowan approached, their hands dropping to the pistols on their hips. Rowan didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't speak. He simply stopped, planting his feet in the dust, his presence a silent challenge. The first man, emboldened by numbers, lunged at him. It was a clumsy, telegraphed attack. Rowan shifted his weight, a subtle pivot of his hips, and the man's punch sailed past his ear. Rowan's own fist shot out, not a wild swing, but a short, brutal jab that connected with the man's jaw. The sound was like a dry branch snapping. The man crumpled to the ground without a sound. Before the second man could even clear his holster, Rowan closed the distance. He grabbed the man's gun hand, twisting it at an unnatural angle until the pistol clattered into the dust. At the same time, his other hand shot up, the heel of his palm connecting with the underside of the man's chin. The man's head snapped back, and he fell backward over the watering trough, landing with a heavy splash. Vern and Pike, who had just stumbled out of the saloon, stopped dead in their tracks, their drunken bravado evaporating in the cool night air. Rowan turned his head slowly, his eyes, now accustomed to the dark, fixing them with a cold, level stare. It was a look that promised nothing but pain, delivered with quiet, methodical precision. He didn't need to say a word. Vern and Pike exchanged a nervous glance, then backed away, dragging their unconscious comrades with them into the shadows. The entire confrontation had taken less than 10 seconds. Rowan walked to the horse and calmly retied its reins to the post. He picked up the fallen pistol, unloaded it, and tossed the weapon and the cartridges in opposite directions into the darkness. Then he turned to Sable, who was standing in the saloon doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. He walked toward her, stopping a respectful few feet away. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her cheek, and he had the fleeting, insane urge to reach out and tuck it behind her ear. He clenched his fist at his side instead. He took the reins of the horse and held them out to her. "You'll sleep at my windbreak station tonight," he said. His voice was rough, deeper than she'd expected, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a dry creek bed. "It's safer." It wasn't a question or an invitation. It was a statement of fact. Sable looked from his outstretched hand to his unreadable face, and for the first time since stepping off that coach, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. She took the leather reins, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was calloused and warm. A slow creak of wood from the saloon's porch made them both turn. Silas Crowley stood there, leaning against a support post, a fresh cigarillo glowing in the dark. He had watched the entire thing. The smug smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold calculation. He took a long drag from the cigarillo, the orange tip illuminating his hard eyes. "Keep her!" Crowley's voice cut through the sound of the wind, sharp and venomous. "Makes no difference. Your land is next. Creed!" The ride from Mesquite Crossing was a silent one, punctuated only by the rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves on the hard-packed earth and the relentless whisper of the wind. Rowan Creed led the way on his own rangy buckskin, a phantom figure against the star-dusted horizon. Sable followed, the borrowed reins feeling strange and unfamiliar in her hands. The darkness of the high desert was absolute, a vast, breathing entity that swallowed the light and muffled the world. It was a loneliness she had never known, yet riding behind the solitary man ahead. She felt a sliver of security that defied all logic. His windbreak station was not a cabin, not a home in the conventional sense. It was a structure built for pure function, a lonely outpost against the elements at the far edge of his property, tucked into a shallow ravine and sheltered by a low mesa. It was little more than a single sturdy room built of stone and rough-hewn timber, with an attached lean-to for his horse. A tall, skeletal windmill creaked and groaned nearby, its blades turning slowly in the ceaseless wind, pumping water into a stone cistern. This was a place of survival, not comfort. Inside, however, a small measure of warmth lingered. A pot-bellied stove in the corner still radiated a gentle heat, and the air smelled of coffee and wood smoke. The furnishings were sparse and handmade, a solid wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed frame built into the wall, and a set of shelves holding a few tinned goods, a handful of books, and neatly stacked ammunition. There were no decorations, no traces of another soul. It was the den of a man who had pared his life down to the barest essentials. Rowan lit a kerosene lantern, and the small room filled with a soft, golden light that pushed the oppressive darkness back outside the single window. He didn't speak, but moved with an economy of motion, taking a thick wool blanket from a storage chest and laying it out on the floor, a good 10 feet from his own bed. He then took a tin cup from a hook, filled it with water from a bucket, and set it on the table before her. A simple, unspoken gesture of hospitality. "Thank you," Sable said, her voice softer than it had been in the saloon. The bravado she had summoned was gone, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. She sank into a chair, her hands wrapping around the cool tin cup. Rowan nodded, his back to her as he checked the latch on the heavy wooden door. "Crowley's men won't look for you this far out. You're safe for the night." For a long moment, the only sound was the howling wind outside and the rhythmic creak of the windmill. Sable watched him, this quiet, dangerous man who had intervened on her behalf for reasons she couldn't fathom. He had asked for nothing, explained nothing. "Why did you help me?" she finally asked, the question breaking the fragile peace. He turned from the door, his face half hidden in the lantern's shadow. "I don't like Crowley, and I don't like seeing men use their numbers against a lone person." He paused, his gaze dropping to the leather tube she had placed carefully on the table. "That deed, it's important to you." The simple statement unlocked something within her. The dam of composure she had so carefully constructed began to crack. "It's more than important," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's a matter of honor." She pulled the brass cap off the tube and gently unrolled the parchment. The deed was not just a legal document to her. It was a testament. My aunt, Elspeth. She was a widow. This spring was all she had left after her husband passed. Crowley wanted the grazing land that bordered her property. He didn't want to buy it outright. He convinced her to sign a lease agreement. He told her it was standard, just for a season. She couldn't read the fine print. None of the women in my family were taught to read contracts, just letters and the Bible. Her voice was laced with a bitterness that was years old. The lease was a trap. It gave him the right to dam a small creek that fed her pastures. Within a year, her grazing land was dust. He bought it from her for pennies on the dollar. It broke her spirit. She died a few months later, and this deed to the spring was all she had to leave me. In her last letter, she wrote, "Don't let him take the water. Sable, it's the only truth left in this valley." Sable looked up at him, her gray eyes shimmering in the lamplight. "So, no, this isn't just about holding on to a piece of land. It's about a promise. It's a debt I owe to her memory." Rowan listened, his expression unchanged, but a new understanding flickered in his eyes. He walked over to the table and pulled out the other chair, sitting down opposite her. He understood debts of honor. The war had been full of them, most of them buried with the dead. "I'm not a man for courts or lawyers," he said, his voice a low rumble. I've seen too many words twisted until they mean the opposite of what was intended. I believe in the land. I believe in what a man can build with his own two hands. And I believe in a person's word. Crowley has none of those things. He builds his empire on paper and fear. He reached out a hand, not to take the deed, but hovering just above it. May I? Sable pushed the parchment towards him. She watched as his calloused fingers, surprisingly gentle, handled the old document. He didn't just read the words. His eyes traced the boundaries, his brow furrowed in concentration as if he were picturing the very lay of the land, the ravines and ridges, the ancient cottonwoods that would surely line the banks of Coyote Draw. He spent a long time looking not at the script, but at the official seal in the bottom corner, a faded, intricate stamp of ink from a time before the territory was carved up into its current counties. The lawyers Crowley keeps on his payroll. They see the missing surveyor's stamp, Rowan murmured, almost to himself. That's all they need to see. They're city men. They read the words, not the land. His finger came to rest on the edge of the old seal. It was a small, almost unnoticeable detail in the ornate design, a tiny, stylized rendering of a flat-topped mountain. But this seal, it was the mark of the old Sandoval County registrar. He was a surveyor himself before he got into politics. He always tied his major deeds to a permanent landmark, something God put there, not man. Rowan looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time she saw a spark of something other than weary vigilance in them. It was the keen glint of a strategist. This mark, he said, tapping the tiny mountain in the seal, is Black Mesa. The deed's legal description starts not from a wooden stake that can be moved or a fence that can be torn down, but from the westernmost spire of Black Mesa. It's a point of origin that Silas Crowley himself cannot dispute, bribe, or bully out of existence. Your aunt's claim isn't just on paper, Miss Hart. It's anchored in solid rock. A breath Sable didn't realize she'd been holding escaped her lips. A fragile tendril of hope began to unfurl in her chest. For weeks, she had looked at that deed as a shield. Rowan Creed had just shown her it could be a sword. What does that mean, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. It means your bluff about a surveyor might just be the smartest thing you could have said. If you can get a man to survey the land from the Black Mesa marker, his findings will be irrefutable. It would validate this old deed under the original territorial laws. They sat in silence for another moment, the weight of this revelation settling between them. An unspoken pact began to form in the quiet room, an alliance forged of necessity and a shared enemy. I can't face him alone, Sable admitted, the words tasting like ash. He'll use his men, his influence. He'll crush me before I can even find a surveyor willing to take the job. And I can't fight him with just a gun, Rowan countered. I can handle his hired thugs, but Crowley's real power is in the papers he signs and the politicians he owns. A range war gets men killed, but it doesn't change a crooked contract. He looked from her determined face to the deed lying between them. It seems we have a problem that neither of us can solve alone. He extended his hand across the table. You protect the paper. I'll protect the person. Sable looked at his hand strong, weathered, steady. She placed her own in it. His grip was firm, a silent confirmation of the terms. It wasn't a handshake of friendship, but a compact, a reluctant treaty signed in the heart of a hostile territory. Together, she said, her voice finding its strength again. We'll keep the spring. We'll have to move fast, Rowan said, withdrawing his hand. Crowley isn't a patient man. He's making a big move. The Founders' Jubilee is in 3 days. I heard talk in town that Mayor Harlan Pike is set to sign over the municipal water rights to Crowley during the celebration. He plans to build an aqueduct, and he wants to be the man who controls every drop of water that flows into Mesquite Crossing. 3 days. The timeline struck Sable like a physical blow. Then we have to act tomorrow. I'll go to the public market. I'll stand up and present my deed. I'll tell everyone about Black Mesa. They have to listen. Rowan shook his head, a grin set to his jaw. They'll listen, and then they'll look away. These people are scared. Miss Hart, Many of them owe money to Crowley's bank. Others lease land from him. They won't risk his wrath for a stranger with an old piece of paper. He'll make you a laughingstock. He'll turn the crowd against you before you've said 10 words. So I should do nothing, she challenged, her spirit flaring. I should hide here while he steals the future of this entire valley. I didn't say do nothing, he replied, his voice calm and even. I said don't be a fool. If you're going to walk into the wolf's den, you don't do it by announcing yourself at the entrance. We need a plan, and we need to be able to communicate without speaking. He leaned forward, the lantern light carving sharp angles on his face. If you insist on going to that market, we'll need signals, a way to act together, even in a crowd. If I lift my hat off my head, he demonstrated, his hand hovering over his imaginary hat, it means trouble is coming and you need to pull back. Immediately. No questions. Sable nodded, her mind racing. And if I need you? The lantern, he said, gesturing to the one on the table. If we get separated and you need to meet, go to the livery stables, touch the brim of a lantern, as if you're checking the heat. I'll see it. I'll be there. It was a simple, practical code, born from the mind of a man used to silent observation, an agreement to trust a gesture more than a word. As they spoke, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness outside the station's single window. Vern Locke, nursing a sore jaw and a bruised ego, had followed them. He had crept up to the cabin, his boots silent in the soft dust, drawn by the sliver of light escaping from a chink in the timber wall. He pressed his ear to the wood, the wind covering any sound he might make. He couldn't hear every word, but he heard enough. He heard the woman's plan to make a scene at the market. He heard her foolish talk of presenting the old deed to the public. He smirked in the darkness. This was perfect. He could report back to Crowley. They could prepare a special welcome for Miss Sable Hart, one that would humiliate her so thoroughly she'd be on the next stagecoach out. Deed and all, satisfied. He missed the crucial conversation that followed the talk of Black Mesa, the surveyor, and the quiet finality of their pact. Believing he had the core of their plan, Vern slipped away, melting back into the night. Inside, their strategy was set. The fire in the stove had died down to glowing embers, and the small room was growing cooler. The weight of the coming day, of the battle ahead, settled upon them. Rowan stood and walked to the lantern. Get some sleep, he said. You'll need it. With a turn of a small key and a soft puff of air, he extinguished the flame. The room was plunged back into absolute darkness. The only reality, the sound of the wind and the presence of the other person breathing in the blackness. Tomorrow morning, his voice came, a low, steady sound in the dark. We leave before the sun. The morning air in Mesquite Crossing was a tapestry of competing sensations. The rich, sweet scent of cinnamon and baked apples wafted from the pie stall run by the ladies' auxiliary, a scent that did battle with the earthy smell of horsehide from the saddlery and the sharp, metallic tang from the blacksmith's forge. A lone fiddler sawed away at a cheerful reel, the lively notes struggling to be heard over the cackle of chickens in their crates, the lowing of cattle in a nearby pen, and the constant hum of human commerce. The market was the town's beating heart, a weekly ritual where ranchers, merchants, and drifters converged in a chaotic dance of gossip and trade. Sable and Rowan moved through the crowd, two islands of quiet purpose in a sea of noise. Rowan walked with a familiar ease, his gaze sweeping the area from beneath the brim of his hat, cataloging faces, noting the positions of Crowley's men who were already present, lounging near the saloon with a predatory laziness. He was a part of the landscape, and no one paid him much mind. Sable, however, was a different story. Whispers followed her like a trail of dust. The events of the previous night had already become local legend, embellished with every telling. She was the woman who had faced down Crowley, the woman the Pinyon Ridge solitary had defended. Every eye that fell upon her was filled with a mixture of curiosity, pity, and suspicion. She clutched the leather tube in her hand, the smooth, cool surface, a small anchor in a swirling vortex of anxiety. Rowan had been right. The faces she saw were closed, wary. These were not people looking for a hero. They were people trying to survive another day. And survival meant not attracting the attention of Silas Crowley. She found her stage on the third step of the general store's porch, a slightly elevated position that forced people to look up at her. She took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of fresh milled flour and leather goods from the store behind her filling her lungs. Then she unrolled the deed. The parchment crackled in the dry air, a sound that seemed impossibly loud, cutting through the market's din. People of Mesquite crossing, her voice was clearer and stronger than she'd felt. A few people stopped, their interest piqued. The fiddle music faltered. "My name is Sable Hart. This document is the legal deed to the land known as Coyote Draw, and the water rights to the spring that feeds it. It was granted to my family, sealed and registered under the laws of this territory." A murmur went through the small crowd that was beginning to gather. It was a bold move, a direct challenge made not in the smoky confines of the saloon, but in the broad, unforgiving light of day. It didn't take long for the wolf to answer the call. Silas Crowley emerged from the saloon, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. He was not alone. Beside him walked a man in a slightly too small city suit, his face pale and sweating under the morning sun. This was Arthur Finch, the county attorney, a man whose legal opinions were known to be as flexible as Crowley's wallet was deep. "Well, well," Crowley boomed, his voice dripping with mock amusement as he and Finch pushed their way to the front of the crowd. "The little lady is holding a town meeting. What a delightful surprise." He turned to Finch. "Mr. Finch, as the ranking legal authority in this fine establishment, perhaps you could enlighten us. Does this document," he said the word as if it were something foul, "hold any water?" Finch produced a pair of spectacles and peered at the deed in Sable's hand, though he made no move to actually read it. He cleared his throat, assuming an air of grave importance. "As I believe was explained last night," he began, his voice reedy and thin, "any deed of this vintage, while perhaps a charming historical artifact, lacks the one thing required by current territorial statute for validation, a contemporary survey and its accompanying stamp. Without it, the boundaries are hearsay, the claim is void, and the document is, in a legal sense, null." Crowley threw his head back and laughed. It was a cruel, performative sound, and it acted as a signal. A few of his men in the crowd immediately joined in, and their laughter spread like a contagion. Soon, a sizable portion of the crowd was chuckling, not out of genuine amusement, but out of a nervous desire to be on the winning side, to align themselves with power. The sound washed over Sable, a wave of humiliation that threatened to drown her. Her hand holding the deed began to tremble, the faces in front of her blurred, their mockery a physical force pushing her down. The world narrowed to the sound of that laughter and the pounding of her own heart. She felt her resolve crumbling, her carefully constructed courage turning to dust. She was about to lower her hand, to admit defeat, when she felt a feather-light touch on her wrist. It was Rowan. He had moved up beside her so silently she hadn't even noticed. He stood just behind her, slightly to the side, his presence a solid, unmovable wall at her back. His fingers rested on her pulse point for a bare second, not a gesture of restraint, but a silent, urgent message. "Breathe. Stay the course." The warmth of his touch was a jolt, a connection that cut through the noise and the fear. She took a sharp breath, and her vision cleared. She looked past Crowley, past the jeering faces, and let her gaze sweep over the crowd. She saw the women, their faces hard and weary, and she remembered her aunt and the promise she had made. Her voice, when it came, did not waver. "Then I will provide one." The laughter died down, replaced by a confused silence. Crowley's smirk faltered. "I will file a new survey," Sable declared, her voice ringing with renewed conviction. "Stamped and registered, before the signing at the Founders' Jubilee." This time, the laughter that erupted was even louder, filled with genuine derision. 3 days find a surveyor, convince him to defy Crowley, and have him map a remote piece of land in 3 days. It was impossible. A fool's errand. "And who?" Crowley sneered, savoring his victory. "Do you expect to perform this miracle St. Peter himself?" "I can." The voice was quiet, but it carried a resonance that cut through the crowd's ridicule. A man stepped forward from the shadow of the blacksmith's shop. He was lean and weathered, his skin the color of burnished copper, a legacy of his mixed Mexican and Apache blood. His black hair was neatly tied back, and his eyes were dark and intelligent, missing nothing. He was Jules Mercado, a man who had once laid down track for the railroad, a man who understood the unyielding language of angles and elevations better than any man in the territory. He was known for his precision and his integrity, qualities that had earned him respect but kept him on the margins of Mesquite Crossing's social hierarchy. He stopped before Sable, his gaze assessing and direct. He looked at the deed in her hand, then at Rowan, giving a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Finally, his eyes rested on Crowley, and there was no fear in them. "I was the last man to survey for the railroad in this territory," Jules said, his voice calm and even. "I know the old markers. If the lady's deed is anchored to Black Mesa, as the old Sandoval seals were, the survey is a matter of work, not miracles. I will do it." The crowd fell completely silent. This was a development no one had anticipated. An outsider, a man beholden to no one, had just called Crowley's bluff. Crowley's face purpled with rage. He had been publicly challenged, his authority questioned. He shot a venomous glare at Vern Locke, who was standing nearby. It was all the signal that was needed. "He's a liar," Vern shouted, shoving a smaller rancher forward. "He's with them. It's a trick." The rancher stumbled into a woman carrying a basket of eggs. The basket flew into the air, and the crowd surged as people tried to avoid the mess. It was the chaos Crowley wanted. In the confusion, Pike, Crowley's other man, lunged toward Sable, his eyes fixed on the leather tube now tucked under her arm. But Rowan was already moving. He didn't engage in the fight. He grabbed Sable's arm, his grip firm. "Now," he said, his voice a low command in her ear. He pulled her off the steps and into the narrow, refuse-strewn alley that ran between the general store and the assayer's office. Pike was right behind them. Rowan slammed the heavy wooden side door of the store shut just as Pike reached it. Without breaking stride, he uncoiled the leather reins from his shoulder, looped them through the door handle and around a thick iron drain pipe, and cinched them tight with a knot only a horseman would know. It wouldn't hold for long, but it would buy them time. From the street, they heard a shout, followed by the hiss and pop of a small, crude device. A thick, acrid smoke began to billow into the alley's entrance. "Get back," Rowan ordered, pushing Sable deeper into the narrow space. He pressed her against the rough brick wall of the general store, shielding her with his own body as the choking smoke filled the air. The alley was a dead end, a claustrophobic trap of brick and splintered wood. They were pinned, the sounds of the brawl and Crowley's angry shouts echoing from the street. The space between them was non-existent. Sable's cheek was pressed against the rough fabric of Rowan's shirt. She could feel the solid wall of his chest, the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her own frantic rhythm. Her breath hitched in her throat. The world shrank to the scent of dust, smoke, and the clean, masculine scent of him. In the dim, smoky light, she looked up, and her eyes fell on his neck. Just below his jawline, half hidden by his collar, was a small, puckered scar, a pale, silvery mark against his sun-darkened skin, an old wound, a bullet hole. It was an intimate, shocking glimpse into the violence that had shaped him, a testament to the past he never spoke of. He must have felt her gaze, because he turned his head slightly, his own eyes meeting hers. For a fraction of a second, the guard was down. She saw something in their depths, a flicker of a memory, a shadow of pain. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He turned his face away, looking back toward the street, his jaw tight, re-establishing the careful distance between them. The shouting from the street began to subside. They heard the authoritative voice of Mayor Pike, restoring a semblance of order. When the smoke finally cleared, Rowan cautiously released the reins and opened the door a crack. The crowd was dispersing, casting nervous glances in their direction. Crowley and his men were gone. They emerged from the alley, blinking in the bright sunlight, covered in a thin layer of dust and grime. The market was trying to resume its normal rhythm, but the air was thick with a new tension. The town was no longer a single, unified body. A line had been drawn. A small group of women, led by a formidable matriarch named Etta Byrne, who owned the town's main mercantile, approached Sable, Mrs. Byrne's face was set in grim lines of approval. "That took guts. Girl," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "My husband was forced to sell a dozen of his best yearlings to Crowley for half their worth last spring. Said he'd call in our credit at the bank otherwise." "We all have a story like that." The other women nodded in agreement, their expressions a mixture of fear and newfound solidarity. Just then, Mayor Harlan Pike bustled over, his face a mask of official concern. "A disgraceful incident," he declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This town will not abide public brawls." He fixed Sable with a hard stare. "And it will not abide baseless claims that disrupt the public peace. The contract for the municipal water rights is a matter of public record and will be signed, as scheduled, in 3 days at the Jubilee. If anyone," he shot a pointed look at Jules Mercado, who was quietly observing from a distance, "has an objection, they had better come with more than an old piece of paper. They had better come with audible proof." He turned on his heel and marched away, leaving his words to hang in the air. Audible proof. An impossible standard, designed to silence her for good. Sable watched him go, a slow burning anger replacing her fear. She looked at the faces of the women, at the quiet dignity of Jules Mercado, and at Rowan, who stood silently beside her, his presence a constant, reassuring weight. They wouldn't listen to a piece of paper. They wouldn't listen to her word against Crowley's. They had to be made to listen to the truth itself. She whispered the words, almost to herself, a vow made to the dusty ground beneath her feet. "They'll have to hear us?" Rowan turned to her, his expression serious, his eyes searching hers. He had seen her fear, her humiliation, and the remarkable strength that had risen from it. He had seen the town turn on her, and he had seen the small, brave handful who had turned towards her. The fight was no longer just hers. He looked at her for a long time, the sounds of the market fading into a distant murmur. "If you have a way to make them listen," he said, his voice low and certain, "I will stand with you." Audible proof. The mayor's words echoed in Sable's mind long after they had left the chaotic market square. They were a sentence, a dismissal, a wall of impossibility designed to end her fight before it had truly begun. She and Rowan sat at a secluded table behind Etta Byrne's mercantile, shielded from prying eyes by stacks of empty barrels and crates. The air was thick with the scent of burlap and dried beans. Sable stared at the scarred wooden tabletop, tracing the grain with a fingertip. He knew what he was saying. How can you argue with a ghost? How can you make a man's own words stand up in court when he will simply deny he ever spoke them? Rowan was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant, shimmering heat rising from the desert floor. "You can't," he said finally. "Not if it's just your word against his." A memory flickered in Sable's mind, hazy at first, then sharpening into focus with a sudden, electrifying clarity. It was from a month ago, during a brief stopover in a larger town on her journey west. A traveling salesman, a man with a slick tongue and a gaudy waistcoat, had set up a demonstration in the town square. He'd had a crowd gathered around a strange wooden box with a large brass horn attached to it. On a small spindle sat a cylinder of dark, brownish wax. Behold, the miracle of the modern age, the salesman had proclaimed, his voice full of manufactured wonder. Mr. Thomas Alva Edison's phonograph, a machine that captures the human voice and holds it for all time. It remembers what you forget. It speaks the truth when you are gone. He had cranked a handle, spoken a few lines of a nursery rhyme into a diaphragm, and then, after adjusting a needle-like stylus, a faint, tinny, but undeniably human voice had echoed back from the horn. It was his own voice, distorted and ghostly, but it was his, a talking machine. Sable had dismissed it then as a novelty, a clever parlor trick for the wealthy. But now it was something else entirely. It was the answer to an impossible question. "A box of ghosts," she whispered, looking up at Rowan, her eyes wide with the birth of a desperate, brilliant idea. "Rowan, I saw a machine. A month ago. A salesman called it a phonograph. He said it could record a man's voice." Rowan's impassive expression shifted. A flicker of intense concentration replaced his weary vigilance. He'd heard rumors of such devices, whispers from back east about machines that could talk and sing, but he'd filed them away with stories of horseless carriages and flying machines, fantastical tales from another world. "Where did you see this?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "A traveling salesman had it," Sable explained, leaning forward, the words tumbling out. "He was just passing through, but Etta Byrne was there. I remember her asking him a dozen questions about the gears and the wax. She was fascinated by the mechanics of it." Without another word, they rose and walked into the mercantile. Etta Byrne was behind the counter, weighing out a sack of flour for a customer. She looked up as they entered, her gaze sharp and questioning. When her customer had left, Sable quickly explained her idea. "Mrs. Byrne listened, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. When Sable finished, the older woman was silent for a long time, tapping a finger on the wooden counter. "A talking machine," she said, her voice a gravelly rasp. I remember the slick-haired fellow. All polish and promises. He tried to sell me that contraption. Said it would be a wonder for the store, playing advertisements to my customers all day long." She snorted. "I told him my customers preferred the peace and quiet. But he was short on cash for the stagecoach fare, so I made him a trade." She jerked her head toward the back of the store. "It's in the storeroom. Traded him for a new saddle and 2 months' worth of provisions. He was happy to be rid of the heavy thing." She fixed Sable with a steely gaze. "It doesn't work, though. The crank is jammed, and a gear is stripped, and the wax cylinders he left are cracked." Her eyes narrowed. "But if you're asking to borrow it, the answer is no. If you're asking for a bargain. However, we can talk." "What's the price?" Sable asked, her heart hammering. "My grandson, Liam, he's 15, smart as a whip, but he can barely read his own name, let alone a contract. Crowley has already been sniffing around our north pasture, talking about water leases. I will not have my family be as foolish as your aunt was. No offense intended." She pointed a flour-dusted finger at Sable. "You get that machine working, and you teach my grandson how to read and write a contract. Not just the words. Girl, the meaning behind them. The traps. You do that, and the machine is yours to use until this business with Crowley is settled." It was more than a fair price. It was an investment in the future, a blow against the very ignorance that had cost her aunt everything. "Done," Sable said without hesitation. The phonograph was a beautiful, wounded thing, housed in a polished oak case. Its brass horn was tarnished, and its intricate machinery was clogged with dust and congealed oil. Rowan carried it to a small, private workshop behind the mercantile and laid it gently on a workbench for the rest of the afternoon, under the watchful eyes of Sable and a fascinated Liam Byrne. He became a surgeon. With a surgeon's delicate touch, he disassembled the mechanism piece by piece, laying the tiny gears and screws out on a clean rag. He found the stripped gear, its teeth worn smooth on one side. He didn't have a replacement, but with a fine-toothed file and a watchmaker's patience, he carefully rescored the teeth, giving them just enough purchase to function. He cleaned every part with the oil and a soft cloth, his large, calloused hands moving with a grace and precision that mesmerized Sable. He seemed to understand the machine's internal logic, its mechanical soul. While he worked, Sable sat with Liam, using her own deed as their first textbook. She pointed out the legal phrases, the binding clauses, the spaces where a single word could change a man's fortune. The boy was a quick study, his shame at his own ignorance quickly replaced by a fierce determination. As dusk began to settle, Rowan finished his work. He had even managed to repair one of the cracked wax cylinders, melting the edges of the fracture together with a heated knife until the seam was almost invisible. He reassembled the phonograph, cranked the handle, and the spindle turned smoothly. "It's ready for a test," he said, his voice quiet with satisfaction. He positioned the recording stylus over the wax cylinder. "Speak into the diaphragm. Something simple." Sable leaned forward, her heart in her throat, and spoke the first words that came to mind. "My name is Sable Hart. This is my voice." Rowan moved the stylus back to the beginning of the cylinder and engaged the playback needle. He turned the crank again. A loud hiss and crackle filled the room. And then, a faint, ghostly sound emerged from the brass horn. It was thin, wavering, and metallic, but it was unmistakably her. "My name, Sable Hart. My voice." Liam's jaw dropped. It was a miracle. It was audible proof. "It's raspy," Rowan noted, his tone critical. "But it's clear. It's audible." Their plan solidified in the dimly lit workshop. The goal was simple, its execution perilous. They had to bait a trap for a wolf. They needed to record Silas Crowley admitting to his scheme to blackmail Mayor Pike. The rumors of the mayor's gambling debts were common knowledge, but rumor wasn't proof. Crowley's own voice would be. While they planned, Jules Mercado was already at work. At the first light of dawn, he had ridden out to the westernmost spire of Black Mesa, a place of stark, wind-scoured beauty. He set up his transit, its brass lens glinting in the morning sun, and began his painstaking work. He drove the first iron stake into the ground, its clang echoing in the vast silence. From that single, irrefutable point, he began to draw a line of truth across the desert, a line that would lead directly to Coyote Draw Spring. It would take him 2 days of relentless, meticulous labor, working under the open sky with nothing but his instruments and his integrity. Crowley's eyes were everywhere. On the second day of the survey, as Jules was working in a shallow arroyo, 2 of Crowley's riders appeared on the ridge above him. They didn't speak, they just watched. That evening, as Jules was preparing a simple meal over a small campfire beside his tent, they returned. He heard the thunder of hooves too late. They rode down on his camp, kicking over his coffee pot and scattering the embers of his fire into the dry brush. One of them threw a lit torch onto his small canvas tent. The dry material caught instantly, erupting in a whoosh of orange flame. Jules lunged for his transit, his most valuable possession. But one of the riders cut him off, laughing as the flames consumed his shelter and his meager supplies. But the riders hadn't counted on Rowan Creed, expecting trouble. Rowan had been tracking them from a distance. He spurred his buckskin into a gallop, charging down the slope like an avenging spirit. He didn't shout, didn't fire a shot. His sudden, silent appearance was enough to spook the 2 thugs. They fired a few wild shots in his direction and fled into the darkness. Rowan leaped from his horse before it had even come to a full stop. The tent was a lost cause, but a large, rolled-up oilskin pouch lay perilously close to the flames. It contained Jules's work, the precious, irreplaceable maps and calculations. As Rowan grabbed the pouch, pulling it from the fire's edge, another horse thundered into the camp. It was Sable. She had been riding out to bring Jules fresh water and had seen the glow of the fire from a mile away. She slid from her horse, grabbed a heavy canvas tarp from her saddle, and began beating at the spreading brush fire, her face grim with determination. Together, they contained the blaze, leaving a blackened, smoking scar on the desert floor. Jules stood amidst the wreckage of his camp, his face streaked with soot, but his maps were safe. He looked from Rowan to Sable, a silent gratitude in his dark eyes. The attack had been meant to stop him, but it had only hardened his resolve. The next day, back in town, Sable put the second phase of her own plan into motion. She gathered Etta Byrne and the small group of women who had supported her at the market, in the back room of the mercantile. By the light of a single lantern, she laid out the original deed. Crowley might destroy a piece of paper, she said, her voice low and steady. He might even destroy the phonograph, but he cannot destroy an idea, not if it's held in many hands. She provided them with fresh parchment and bottles of indelible ink, with painstaking care. They created 3 exact copies of the deed, replicating every word, every flourish of the old script. One copy was given to Mrs. Byrne for safekeeping. Another was given to the wife of the blacksmith. The third, the most important backup, was sealed in an oilcloth pouch, weighted with a small stone, and, in the dead of night, lowered deep into the cold, dark water of the stone-lined church well. Their small conspiracy was growing. A quiet web of resistance spun in the shadows of Crowley's power. That same night, Rowan met with Sable and Jules in the livery stables. He lit a lantern, its steady glow casting their long shadows against the rough-hewn walls. "If things go wrong," he said, "we'll need a way to signal, a way to call for help without shouting." He held the lantern up. 3 quick flashes, a pause, 2 flashes, a pause, then 3 more. Memorize it. It's the signal for an emergency. If you see it, you come. If you need to send it, I'll see it. They rehearsed it until the pattern was second nature, a secret language of light spoken in the darkness. All the pieces were now in place. Jules, with a borrowed tent and a new stock of provisions, was back at his survey, working faster than ever. The copies of the deed were hidden. The phonograph was waiting, a silent witness. The trap was designed. All that was left was for the prey to walk into it. The target location was a large, isolated hay barn on the edge of Crowley's property, a place he sometimes used for private meetings. The wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the stable walls, a lonely, mournful sound. It swept across the high desert, rustling the dry leaves of the cottonwoods and whispering through the dark, twisted branches of the junipers, on the vast, dusty chessboard of Mesquite Crossing. The pawns were in position, the trap was set, and the heartbeat of the story began to quicken, counting down the hours to a night of reckoning. The day of the trap began with a sky of deceptive tranquility. A pale, hazy sun hung in the vast blue expanse, and the air was unnervingly still. A strange, oppressive silence had fallen over Pinyon Ridge, the kind that often precedes a violent break in the weather. Rowan, Sable, and Jules had gathered in the pre-dawn hours at the abandoned windbreak station to go over the final details of their plan. Jules was to lay low, acting as a lookout from the high ground, while Sable and Rowan would proceed to the hay barn after nightfall. By mid-afternoon, however, the world began to change. A low, brownish-red line appeared on the western horizon, a stain that slowly and inexorably grew. Swallowing the blue of the sky, the stillness broke, replaced by a nervous, twitching breeze that carried the first stinging grains of sand. The birds fell silent. The insects stopped their chirping. "Sandstorm," Rowan said, his voice a flat, factual statement. He looked at the roiling wall of dust. His eyes narrowed. "And a bad one. It'll be on us in an hour." They were too far from town to make it back safely, and his main cabin was a hard ride in the opposite direction. Their only option was a small, dilapidated line shack and an attached stable not far from where they stood, a relic from a previous homesteader who had long since been defeated by the unforgiving land. They gathered their horses and supplies, the wind now whipping at their clothes and hair, and rode hard for the meager shelter. They made it just as the vanguard of the storm struck. The sun vanished, snuffed out behind a churning, 1,000-foot wall of red dust. Day turned to a suffocating, gritty twilight. The wind hit the small wooden shack with the force of a physical blow, a solid wall of sound and fury. It screamed through the cracks in the walls, a high, keening wail like a banshee. The shack was little more than a single room, barely large enough for the three of them and their most essential gear. It smelled of dry rot and old memories. Rowan forced the warped wooden door shut and braced it with a heavy timber, the wood groaning in protest as the full force of the storm slammed against it. Fine. Red dust immediately began to sift through every crack and crevice, coating everything in a paprika-colored film. Jules, ever practical, immediately began checking the integrity of the roof, while Rowan worked to light a small, protected fire in the crumbling stone hearth. Sable stood by the single grimy window, peering out at the maelstrom. She could see nothing but a swirling, chaotic vortex of red-brown. It was like being inside a malevolent cloud. The world outside had ceased to exist. As the hours wore on, the temperature inside the shack plummeted. The storm had brought a chilling cold with it, a dampness that seeped into their bones. Sable, dressed for a warm desert day, began to shiver, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The constant, abrasive hiss of the sand against the walls was like a file on her nerves, and the fine dust in the air made her throat raw. She huddled closer to the small, sputtering fire, but its warmth seemed to be swallowed by the cold drafts that snaked across the floor. Rowan noticed her shivering. He had been sitting on an overturned crate, cleaning his pistol with methodical, calming motions. Without a word, he stood up, walked over to his saddlebags, and pulled out a heavy, sheepskin-lined coat. It was a well-worn, practical garment that smelled of leather, wood smoke, and him. He walked over to where she sat on the floor and draped the coat over her shoulders. It was large and heavy, a comforting weight that immediately began to insulate her from the biting cold. The thick wool lining was incredibly soft against her skin. "Thank you," she murmured, pulling the collar up around her neck and sinking into its warmth. The distance between them, always so carefully maintained, had suddenly shrunk to nothing. He was standing over her, his presence a shield against the storm's fury. He merely nodded and returned to his crate, but he didn't pick up his pistol again. He just sat, watching the fire, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. Jules, sensing a private moment unfolding, announced he was going to check on the horses in the attached stable, and slipped through a connecting doorway, leaving them alone. The roar of the wind was a constant, deafening presence, making normal conversation impossible. They had to lean closer, their voices lowered to be heard over the gale. "I've never been in a storm like this," Sable said, her voice a near whisper. "They come on fast," Rowan replied, his eyes on the dancing flames. "The land gives you no warning. You learn to read the signs, or you don't last long." "My Aunt Elspeth, she didn't know how to read the signs," Sable said softly. "The storm dredging up the old grief, not the ones in the sky, and not the ones hidden in the fine print of a contract. She trusted people. She believed a person's word was their bond. She didn't understand that words could be weapons, that they could be twisted into traps." She pulled the heavy coat tighter around herself. "That's why I have to do this. It's not just for the water. It's for her, so no one can ever say she was just a foolish woman who was easily tricked." Rowan was silent for a long time, the firelight casting deep shadows on his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. "Words can be traps," he agreed, his gaze turning inward. "But silence can be a prison." He had never spoken of himself, not once. He was a man defined by his actions, his past a locked room with no key. But the storm, the isolation, the raw emotion of her confession, it had found a crack in the wall he had built around himself. "There was a battle," he began, his voice rough with disuse, as if the words themselves were painful to form. by a creek in Tennessee. It wasn't a famous battle. It won't be in any of the history books. But there was more noise than I thought the world could hold. Cannons and rifle fire and men screaming. It went on for 2 days. When it was over, and the silence fell, it was worse than the noise. He paused, taking a slow, deep breath. Something inside me went quiet that day. The part of you that talks to yourself, that hopes or plans or feels, it just stopped. For years, I just was. I worked, I ate, I slept, but I didn't speak. Not even inside my own head. Coming out here to all this quiet. He gestured vaguely towards the storm-lashed walls. It was the only place that felt honest. Sable listened, her heart aching for the man he had been and the silent shell he had become. She finally understood his solitude, the profound and painful reason for his carefully guarded distance. He wasn't just a solitary man, he was a man in exile from himself. Just then, a violent gust of wind hit the shack with the force of a battering ram. The entire structure shuddered, and the roof groaned as if it were about to tear away. A shower of dust and debris rained down from the ceiling. Sable flinched, letting out a small, involuntary cry. In an instant, Rowan was in front of her. He didn't hesitate. He reached out and placed a hand on her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin, his touch a steady anchor in the chaos. The simple, protective gesture was more intimate than any embrace. "You are not alone on this land," he said, his voice a low, firm promise against the screaming wind. His eyes held hers, and in their depths, she saw the walls he had so carefully maintained finally crumble. She saw the man who had been silenced for so long, looking out at her. The space between them was electric, charged with all the unspoken words, the shared dangers, and the profound, unexpected connection they had forged. The roar of the storm faded into a distant hum. The world narrowed to his hand on her cheek, the warmth of his calloused skin, the intensity of his gaze. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. She met him halfway, her eyes fluttering shut as his lips met hers. The kiss was not born of passion, but of something deeper, quieter. It was a kiss of recognition, of finding a kindred soul in the most desolate of places. It was slow and gentle and searching, a silent conversation in a world full of noise. It was the taste of wood smoke and coffee, the feeling of safety in the heart of a storm. He pulled back a fraction of an inch, his forehead resting against hers. They looked at each other, their breath mingling in the cold air. No words were needed. In that shared gaze, they saw the truth of what was happening between them. Then, with a tenderness that made her heart ache, he lowered his head and kissed her again. This time, it was deeper, a confirmation of the promise the first kiss had made. He drew her to her feet, and she went into his arms, burying her face in the rough fabric of his shirt. He held her close, his arms wrapped around her, the sheepskin coat a shared cocoon against the raging storm. Her fingers found his, and their hands intertwined. A simple, perfect fit. The fire in the hearth cast their single shadow, flickering and dancing, against the rough timber wall. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song, but inside the small, fragile shelter, two solitary souls had found a quiet harbor. The storm raged on, but its fury no longer mattered. They simply stood, holding each other, as the sound of the wind slowly began to fade into a peaceful, all-encompassing silence. Sable awoke to a profound quiet. The storm had passed. The fire had burned down to a pile of soft, glowing embers, casting a faint, warm light on the small room. Sometime during the night, they had sunk to the floor, and she was curled up against Rowan, her head resting on his chest, the heavy sheepskin coat still wrapped around them both like a blanket. His arms were still around her, his breathing slow and even. He was asleep. She lay still, not wanting to break the spell. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt completely, utterly safe. She listened to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart beneath her ear. Slowly, a pale, Rosy light began to seep through the cracks in the walls, the first light of dawn. A single, thin ray of sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It crept across the floor and touched Rowan's face. A faint, peaceful smile graced his lips in his sleep. He stirred, his eyes opening slowly. He looked down at her, and his smile widened. There was no awkwardness, no regret. There was only a quiet, profound sense of rightness. She smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile. In the shared light of the new day, a silent vow was made, a commitment that needed no words. They rose and, without speaking, began to prepare for the day. Their movements synchronized, a comfortable, easy rhythm between them. He rekindled the fire while she made coffee. They stood side by side, holding warm tin cups, and looked out the grimy window as the sun climbed higher, flooding the newly washed desert with a clean, golden light. They had a battle to fight, a dangerous plan to execute, but they would no longer face it as two separate people. They would face it together. He turned to her, his expression serious, his eyes holding the warmth of the morning sun. He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her skin. He leaned in, his lips close to her ear, his warm breath a soft caress. "When the time comes," he whispered, his voice a low, intimate rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "I'll give the signal." Sable leaned into him, her chest pressing against his, feeling the steady strength of him. She looked out at the vast, silent desert, no longer seeing it as an enemy, but as a witness. "They'll hear us," she whispered back, her voice filled with a new, unshakable certainty. The moon was a sliver of bone, offering just enough light to cast treacherous, elongated shadows across the landscape. The air was cold, scrubbed clean by the sandstorm, and it carried the scent of dust and juniper. Sable rode alone, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest. She had dressed the part, wearing her most modest traveling suit, her hair pulled back severely, her face a mask of desperate humility. She carried a small, heavy coin purse, filled with the last of her own money, the interest payment for Mayor Pike. The hay barn loomed from the darkness, a massive, dark shape against the paler, star-flecked sky. It was isolated, a full mile from Crowley's main ranch house, chosen for its privacy, as she had been instructed in a terse, anonymous note. She rode to the side entrance and dismounted. A single, low-burning lantern hung by the door, casting a sickly yellow glow. Minutes earlier, Rowan had moved like a ghost through the shadows. He had scaled the barn's rear wall, his fingers and toes finding purchase in the rough timber, and slipped inside through the hayloft door. Now, he was perched on a massive crossbeam high above the barn floor, invisible in the thick, oppressive darkness. Below him, nestled in the shadows under an overturned corn bin, sat the Edison phonograph. A thin waxed cord was tied around the machine's crank. The cord ran up the wall, over the beam, and into Rowan's hand. It was an imperfect, desperate system. He would have one chance to start the recording. His other hand rested on a heavy coil of rope, a cowbell attached to its end. A single, sharp tug would be his signal to Jules, who was watching the barn from a distant ridge. Sable pushed open the creaking door. The interior smelled of dry grass, harness leather, and something else, the faint, sour odor of fear. Mayor Harlan Pike was there, pacing nervously by a stack of hay bales. "You're late," he hissed, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked not at her, but at the door, at the shadows, at anything but her eyes. "I had to be careful," Sable said, her voice a convincing blend of weariness and fright. She held out the coin purse. "Here, it's all I could gather. Please, Mayor, you must tell Mr. Crowley this is all I have." "He doesn't want your money, girl," a new voice boomed from the darkness. Silas Crowley stepped out from behind a massive support pillar, a lit cigarillo glowing like a single red eye. Behind him stood the ever-present Vern Locke. He wants your obedience. Pike flinched as if he'd been struck. Silas, I told you, I'm handling this. You're handling nothing. Harlan, Crowley sneered. Advancing on the mayor, he completely ignored Sable, treating her as nothing more than a piece of furniture. You're a weak-willed fool who can't hold his cards. You owe me more than this town can ever repay. Your signature on that water contract tomorrow is just the first installment on your debt. High above, Rowan's hand tightened on the waxed cord. This was it. He pulled, slowly, steadily. The crank on the phonograph began to turn. A faint, almost imperceptible whirring sound started, masked by the nervous shifting of Pike's boots in the hay. The stylus was cutting its groove. Sable stepped forward, her body trembling, playing her part to perfection. Mr. Crowley, please, the mayor, the town, they need that water. The Coyote Draw Spring is mine, but if you would just be reasonable, we could come to an arrangement for the good of the people. Crowley laughed. It was a harsh, booming sound that echoed in the rafters. He turned to her, his eyes glittering with triumphant malice. The good of the people are cattle. They drink where I tell them to drink. He took a long, arrogant drag from his cigarillo. You think your little performance at the market meant anything? You think that old deed matters? This is what matters. He jabbed a thick finger at the cowering mayor. Control. I own this man. And tomorrow, he will sign that contract. And once it's signed, I will lock up every last source of water in this valley, including your precious little spring. This whole territory will be on its knees, begging me for a drink, and I will decide who gets one and who doesn't. His laughter rang out again, sharp and victorious. The phonograph whirred faithfully in the darkness, the wax cylinder spinning, the tiny needle carving every single arrogant, damnable word into its surface. Sable had her proof. Now, they had to get it out. As Crowley laughed, Vern Locke's gaze drifted away. He wasn't celebrating. He was scanning, his eyes, sharper and more suspicious than his boss's, swept the shadowy corners of the barn. He saw the overturned corn bin. He saw the faint, telltale glint of polished oak and brass in the lantern light. And he saw something more. A single, tiny, dark shaving of wax on the dusty floor, spun off from the freshly repaired cylinder. His eyes went wide. He pointed, his voice a panicked yell. Boss, it's a trap, that box. It's one of them talking machines. Crowley's laughter died in his throat, his face contorting with rage. What, get it? Vern lunged for the bin, but he was too late. A dark shape descended from the rafters. A silent, sudden weight. Rowan landed between Vern and the phonograph, his knees bent, absorbing the impact as lightly as a cat. He rose to his full height, a formidable shadow in the dim light. Get the machine, Sable, he commanded. Chaos erupted. Vern clawed for his pistol. Rowan didn't give him the chance. He slammed the heel of his hand into Vern's shoulder, sending him staggering back into a towering stack of hay bales. Crowley roared and grabbed for Sable. But Sable was already in motion. She had been standing near a network of ropes and pulleys used for lifting hay into the loft. Her hand found the one she'd marked earlier. She yanked it with all her strength. High above, a 50-pound sack of oat flour, stored in the loft for winter feed, tilted and fell. It burst open as it hit the floor, erupting in a massive, choking cloud of white powder. The air was instantly filled with a thick, blinding fog. My eyes, Pike shrieked, stumbling and gagging. Sable! Now Rowan yelled through the white haze. Sable dove for the corn bin, her hands finding the precious machine. It was heavy, awkward. She cradled it to her chest as Rowan grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. Vern emerged from the flower cloud, looking like a ghost, his face caked in white. He fired his pistol, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. The muzzle flash was a brilliant, blinding orange, and the bullet thudded harmlessly into a support beam. Rowan shoved Sable out the side door and turned back for a split second. He grabbed the single lantern hanging by the entrance and hurled it deep into the barn, not into the hay, but against the far stone wall, where it shattered, plunging the entire interior into absolute, disorienting blackness. "This way," he yelled, pulling her toward their horses, hidden in a dense thicket of mesquite 100 yards away. They heard shouts and more gunshots from the barn as Crowley and his men scrambled in the dark, choking on the flour. Sable and Rowan reached their horses. "Hold him steady," Rowan ordered. He unslung a set of leather thongs from his saddle, while Sable controlled the nervous horses. He strapped the phonograph securely to the back of his own saddle, the heavy machine bumping awkwardly. "Ride," he yelled, swinging up onto his buckskin. They burst from the mesquite grove, galloping hard for the darkness of the open desert. Behind them, Crowley's men, having found the main door, spilled out of the barn. They leaped onto their own horses, their curses lost in the wind. "There they are, don't let them get away," Crowley's voice roared. The chase began. They rode low and fast, their horses' hooves pounding a desperate rhythm on the hard-pan earth. The night was their only cover. Behind them, the dark was punctuated by flashes of orange muzzle flashes from their pursuers' rifles. The bullets whined past them like angry hornets, fiery comet tails in the blackness. They didn't ride for the windbreak station. They didn't ride for town. They rode for the one place of sanctuary they had left. They veered hard to the north, pushing their horses to their limit, taking a winding, dangerous path through a dry arroyo that Rowan knew like the back of his hand. It was a longer route, but it would throw their pursuers off the scent. An hour later, they arrived at the back entrance of the small adobe church in Mesquite Crossing. Their horses were lathered in sweat, their sides heaving. Father Miguel, an elderly priest with a face like carved mahogany, was waiting. He opened the sacristy door, his dark eyes filled with a calm, quiet resolve. They unstrapped the phonograph and carried it inside, by the light of a single candle. Rowan carefully removed the wax cylinder. It was intact. Every word, every laugh, was trapped in those tiny, spiraling grooves. This was the original. This was the truth. Sable then produced the blank decoy cylinder they had prepared, the one that had been cracked and was now roughly repaired. She slid it onto the phonograph's spindle, leaving it there, ready to be found. Rowan took the precious, original cylinder, wrapped it in a soft oilcloth, and followed the priest out to the church courtyard. In the center stood the old stone well. Father Miguel handed him a length of thin, strong cord. Rowan secured it to the pouch, and together they lowered the evidence deep into the cold, dark, silent water. It was safe, hidden where no one would ever think to look. They returned to the sacristy, the adrenaline of the chase finally beginning to ebb, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. "Tomorrow, at the Jubilee," Sable said to the priest, her voice low, "when I place the decoy cylinder on the machine, and Mr. Crowley attempts to destroy it, that is the moment. You will ring the bell." The old priest nodded slowly. "3 times, as you asked, the sound of truth will be heard." He gave them his blessing and left them in the quiet darkness of the small room. For a long moment, they just stood there, breathing, the silence of the church a stark contrast to the violence of the night. They were alive. They had the evidence. Rowan turned to her. In the dim candlelight, his face was soft, the hard lines eased by relief and something more. A rare, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his thumb brushing away a smudge of flour. He leaned his forehead against hers, a simple, profound gesture of connection. "We still have an unfinished kiss," he whispered, his voice a low, warm rumble that vibrated through her. It was a promise of a time after this, a time when they could be more than just soldiers in a war, a time for the life that waited for them, just on the other side of the dawn. The day after the raid on the hay barn, Mesquite Crossing awoke to a town divided not by fences, but by whispers. Silas Crowley, moving with astonishing speed, launched his counterattack. It was not a war of fists or bullets, but of words. A poison dripped into the well of public opinion. The rumor started in the saloon and spread like wildfire. Vern Locke, his face a mask of righteous indignation, told anyone who would listen about the deceitful trick played by the Heart Woman and the Pinion Ridge Solitary. It was some kind of music box, he'd say, shaking his head in feigned bewilderment. Made a terrible squawking noise, like a dying chicken. You couldn't make out a word of it. She's a charlatan, a mesmerist, trying to confuse you all with cheap parlor tricks. Crowley, meanwhile, played the benevolent patriarch. He had a wagon of hard candy brought in from Santa Fe and distributed it to the town's children, a gesture of magnanimity that was as calculated as it was false. He sent his men to every small rancher with gifts of smoked bacon and sacks of flour, neighborly tokens that were understood to be both a bribe and a warning. He was buying loyalty, or, at the very least, a public performance of it. He was reminding everyone who it was that filled their bellies and sweetened their children's lives. The message was clear. The woman offered only noise and confusion. He offered tangible sustenance. Sable watched this campaign of doubt and division unfold, and she knew that to argue against it directly would be futile. To deny the rumors would only give them more air to breathe. She had to fight on a different front. She had one full day before the Jubilee, and she intended to use it to plant a different kind of seed. She went to Etta Byrne, in the back room of the Mercantile, which had become their unofficial headquarters. She gathered the small group of women who had stood by her. Crowley controls this town because he controls the words on paper, Sable told them, her voice low and intense. He uses our lack of knowledge as a weapon. Today, we start to take that weapon away from him. She called it a contract class, using the copies of her own deed, as well as old lease agreements and bills of sale that Mrs. Byrne had kept for years. Sable began to teach. It was not a lesson in reading, but in translation. She broke down the dense, impenetrable legal language into simple, plain-spoken truths. She explained how a single clause about water access could mean the loss of a whole pasture, how a seemingly innocent right-of-way could allow a man to drive 1,000 head of cattle through your best grazing land. Word spread quietly from one woman to another. By midday, the back room was filled with the wives of ranchers and merchants, women who had for years simply trusted their husbands to handle such matters. They sat on crates and barrels, their faces wrapped with a dawning, horrified understanding. They saw their own family histories reflected in the tricky clauses and hidden conditions. They recognized the language that had cost them a few acres here, a dozen head of cattle there. It was a quiet, profound awakening. Sable wasn't just teaching them to read contracts. She was giving them a language for their own long-held, unspoken resentments. She was arming them not with guns, but with knowledge. While Sable was fighting her quiet war of words, a more tangible victory was being won. Just after noon, a rider appeared on the edge of town, his horse caked in dust. It was Jules Mercado. He rode directly to the church, where Sable, Rowan, and a handful of their allies were waiting. He dismounted, unstrapped his precious oilskin pouch, and unrolled a beautiful, precise new map on the churchyard stone font. "It is done," he announced, his voice steady with the satisfaction of a master craftsman. From the western spire of Black Mesa to the source of Coyote Draw Spring, the boundaries are as true as the stars. He then produced the official survey document, his elegant script and precise calculations filling the page. The town's circuit judge, a man who owed Crowley nothing and prized the law above all else, had agreed to meet them there. He reviewed Jules's work, compared it to the original deed, and, finding it flawless, he brought out his official seal. With a firm, decisive thud, he embossed the survey with the bright red, waxen seal of the New Mexico Territory. It was done. The deed was no longer a relic. It was a legally validated, ironclad claim. Mayor Pike heard the news and felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He was a man caught in a vice. He sat in his small, stuffy office, staring at the water contract on his desk. Crowley's name a black stain on the paper. His debt was a mountain, his honor a molehill. He heard a soft knock, and his wife, Martha, entered, her face etched with a quiet, desperate plea. She was a woman who had attended Sable's class. She didn't raise her voice. She simply came and stood beside his desk, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Harlan," she said softly. "Our Sarah. She loves to pick the wildflowers down by Miller's Creek. If Crowley dams that creek, there will be no more flowers." She paused, letting the simple image hang in the air. "He's not just taking the water, Harlan. He's taking the future. He's taking the things our daughter loves." Is any debt worth that? She squeezed his shoulder, her touch a silent prayer, and left him alone with his conscience. Rowan, meanwhile, was turning a legal victory into a physical reality. He knew that even with the validated deed, the small ranchers would still be at Crowley's mercy unless they acted together. He rode from one small spread to the next, not making speeches, but speaking plainly. "One man's trough can be overturned," he told them, "but a trough built by 10 men is a foundation." He proposed the Mesquite Water Cooperative. The idea was simple. Sable would grant the cooperative rights to draw from Coyote Draw, and in return, the ranchers would pool their resources to build a long, sturdy wooden flume and a series of troughs that would benefit them all. It was a declaration of independence. One by one, the ranchers, men who had been cowed by Crowley for years, agreed. They had seen Rowan's quiet strength, Sable's fierce courage, and Jules's unwavering integrity. A spark of hope had been lit. They gathered their resources. Every man with a stand of timber on his land offered it up. By late afternoon, a train of 6 wagons, heavily laden with freshly cut lumber, was ready to roll into Mesquite Crossing. But Crowley had anticipated them. As the lead wagon approached the main road, it was met by a barricade of rocks and a dozen of Crowley's men, armed and waiting. The lead driver sent a boy riding back with the news. Rowan received it without a word. He looked at the sun, now sinking toward the horizon. He looked at the determined, worried faces of the ranchers around him. "There's another way," he said. "Ocotillo Rock Pass. It's steep and it's dangerous in the dark, but it will bring us out on the north side of town. They won't be expecting it." What followed was a testament to the renewed spirit of the valley, with Rowan in the lead. The small caravan of wagons turned away from the main road and began the treacherous climb into the high country. It was a brutal, back-breaking journey. They navigated narrow ledges where a single misplaced wheel would have sent a wagon crashing into the canyon below. They double-teamed their horses to haul the heavy loads up steep, rocky inclines. Rowan moved among them, a silent, commanding presence. His knowledge of the unforgiving terrain their only guide. They worked by moonlight and by lantern, their curses and the groaning of the wagon wheels echoing in the profound silence of the mountains. They were no longer just a group of individuals. They were a community, forged in the darkness of a mountain pass. Their shared sweat and struggle a bond far stronger than Crowley's fear. Just as the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern sky, the last wagon rolled down from the hills and into the sleeping streets of Mesquite Crossing. The lumber had arrived. As the men had toiled in the mountains, Sable had undertaken her own pilgrimage. She went from house to house, from one small, dusty ranch to the next. She didn't argue or persuade. She simply knocked on each door, met the eyes of the person who answered, and extended a personal invitation. "Tomorrow, at the Jubilee," she would say, her voice calm and steady. "I ask you to come to the town square. There is evidence that needs to be heard, evidence that speaks for itself." Her quiet sincerity was more powerful than any threat or bribe. She was not asking them to fight. She was asking them to listen. Crowley's spies reported everything. He heard about the contract class, the validated survey, and, most infuriatingly, the lumber train's successful circumvention of his blockade, his rage grew into a petty, destructive impulse. He could not stop the Jubilee, but he could silence its symbolic voice. In the dead of night, he sent Vernlock and 2 others to the church. They didn't break down the door. They climbed the bell tower. With a heavy iron pry bar, they worked on the bell's massive mounting yoke. With a great groaning screech of tortured metal, the yoke snapped. The great bronze bell, the voice of the town for 50 years, tilted and then fell. It did not crash to the ground. It became wedged, cracked and silent, in the framework of the tower. Father Miguel discovered the sabotage at dawn. He stood in the courtyard, his heart heavy, and looked up at the silenced bell. But his spirit was not broken. He looked across the square at the tall, skeletal windmill that Rowan had built years ago, its vanes turning slowly in the morning breeze. An idea formed in his wise old eyes. He enlisted the help of the blacksmith, and together they hoisted a new bell into place. They hung the largest, deepest-toned cowbell from the cooperative's herd on a temporary rope from one of the windmill's stationary support arms. The sound would not be as grand, but it would be heard. It was the simple, honest voice of the land, replacing the official voice that had been broken. The day of the Founders' Jubilee arrived. An atmosphere of immense, unspoken tension hung over Mesquite Crossing. The town square was decorated with flags and bunting, but the festive colors could not hide the grim, watchful expressions on the faces of the people. They gathered in their Sunday best, the women in starched dresses, the men in clean shirts, small children, blissfully unaware of the adult drama swirling around them, ran through the crowd, their hair adorned with crowns of wild daisies. They were a poignant, innocent counterpoint to the impending storm. Sable stood on the porch of the Mercantile with Etta Byrne. She saw Jules Mercado take up a position near the blacksmith's shop, his new survey map held in a protective oilskin. She saw the ranchers of the new cooperative, standing together in a silent, solid block. Then she saw Rowan. He was across the square, leaning against the windmill, his arms crossed, his gaze steady. He looked at her, his eyes cutting across the crowded space, and he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a confirmation, a promise. They were ready. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to finally speak. The town square of Mesquite Crossing simmered under the midday sun, a pressure cooker of unspoken anxieties. The colorful flags and patriotic bunting that flapped from every storefront seemed a mocking parody of celebration. A wooden platform had been erected in front of the town hall, and on it sat a small table with a single, ominous document and a pot of ink. Mayor Harlan Pike stood at the center of the platform, his face a ghastly shade of pale. He cleared his throat, but the sound that came out was a dry, rasping cough. He looked out at the sea of faces before him, faces he had known his entire life. He saw their fear, their suspicion, and their desperate, flickering hope. His wife, Martha, stood in the front row, her gaze fixed on him, her expression not of judgment, but of profound, aching disappointment. Beside the mayor, Silas Crowley lounged in a large oak chair he'd had brought from the saloon, the picture of magnanimous, predatory triumph. He surveyed the crowd with the proprietary air of a king viewing his subjects, a smug smile playing on his lips. Today was his coronation. "Friends, neighbors," Mayor Pike began, his voice trembling so badly he had to grip the edges of the small table to steady himself. "We are gathered today, on the anniversary of our town's founding, to look to the future, to secure our prosperity." He licked his dry lips. Progress requires bold action. It requires partnerships. Therefore, it is with an eye toward a prosperous future that the town council has approved a contract granting exclusive municipal water rights to Mr. Silas Crowley. A low, ugly murmur rippled through the crowd. It was the sound of resignation, of defeat. The ranchers of the new cooperative stood in a tight, silent knot. their faces like stone. Etta Burns' arms were crossed, her mouth a thin, grim line. Pike picked up the pen, his hand shaking uncontrollably. The nib hovered over the paper, a black teardrop of ink threatening to fall and seal the town's fate. "Stop!" The word was not shouted, but it cut through the tense silence with the clarity of a bell. Every head turned. Sablehart was walking toward the platform, her steps measured and deliberate. She moved not with the desperation of a supplicant, but with the cold, unshakable purpose of an executioner. She ascended the 3 short steps and stood before the mayor, her slight frame casting a long shadow in the afternoon sun. In one hand, she held her family's original deed. In the other, she held Jules Mercado's newly validated survey, the red wax seal of the territory gleaming like a drop of fresh blood. She did not address Crowley. She spoke directly to the mayor and to the people of Mesquite Crossing. "Mayor Pike," she said, her voice ringing with a strength that belied her size. "You cannot sign that document. The water rights you are attempting to sell are not yours to give. They belong to the owner of Coyote Draw Spring, and that owner is me." She laid the original deed on the table. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she placed Jules's survey beside it. "This is a legal claim, anchored in the rock of Black Mesa, and validated by the laws of this territory as of yesterday." The crowd surged forward, a wave of shock and disbelief. Pike stared at the documents as if they were venomous snakes. Crowley, however, merely chuckled. He rose slowly from his chair, clapping his hands in mock applause. "A magnificent performance. My dear, truly, more paper, more pretty words." He turned to the crowd, his voice dripping with condescension. "She has shown you a piece of paper that says she owns a spring. What she has not shown you is any proof of my supposed wrongdoing. The mayor himself told you, we need audible proof." He fixed Sable with a cruel, glittering stare, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial taunt. "So, tell us, little lady, can you make the air speak? Did you bring a voice in that pretty little purse of yours?" It was the signal, the perfect, arrogant, self-incriminating cue. From the edge of the crowd, a figure stepped forward. It was Rowan Creed. He carried the Edison phonograph, its polished oak and brass horn gleaming in the sun. He didn't look at Crowley. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes were fixed on Sable. He walked to the platform, set the heavy machine down on the edge, and gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. The crowd gasped. This was the talking machine from the rumors. It was real. Rowan placed the decoy cylinder, the cracked, roughly repaired one, onto the spindle. He positioned the playback stylus, and then, his movements calm and deliberate, he began to turn the crank. A loud, grating hiss filled the square, followed by a series of pops and crackles. For a moment, it sounded just as Vern Locke had described the squawking of a dying chicken. A few of Crowley's men began to laugh. And then, a voice emerged from the horn. It was thin, tinny, and distorted. A ghost of a voice. But it was absolutely, undeniably the voice of Silas Crowley. "I own this man," the machine squawked. "Tomorrow, he will sign that contract. And once it's signed, I will lock up every last source of water in this valley. This whole territory will be on its knees, begging me for a drink." The voice ended with a ghostly, cackling laugh that echoed across the stunned, silent square. The transformation in the crowd was instantaneous and absolute. Every trace of doubt, every whisper of disbelief, was vaporized. They had heard it. They had heard the truth from the devil's own mouth. A low, collective gasp swept through the people, followed by a rising tide of fury. Crowley's face went white, then a mottled, apoplectic purple. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. He was a man who had just watched his own soul be played back to him. Vern Locke, reacting with the brute instinct of a cornered animal, was the first to move. "Smash it," he screamed, and lunged for the platform. his eyes wild, his hands clawed, reaching for the machine. But Rowan was waiting for him. He stepped directly into Vern's path, a solid, unmovable object. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply stood there, a human shield, absorbing the force of Vern's charge. Vern crashed into him, and the two men became a tangle of grappling limbs at the edge of the stage. It was the diversion, the critical, planned-for moment of chaos. While all eyes were on the two struggling men, Sable moved with lightning speed. Her hand darted out. She plucked the spinning decoy cylinder from the phonograph's spindle. She didn't hesitate. "Vern!" Here she cried out. She tossed the cylinder in a high, easy arc. Vern, breaking away from Rowan for a second, looked up. He saw the cylinder, the source of all their trouble, flying through the air. A look of triumphant relief washed over his face. He caught it in both hands as if it were a holy relic, believing he had saved his master. He raised it high above his head and, with a guttural roar of victory, he smashed it down onto the wooden platform. The wax cylinder shattered into 100 useless brown fragments. At that exact, precise instant, a new sound cut through the air. Bong! It was not the rich, resonant peal of the church bell. It was a deep, earthy, clangorous tone, the sound of the cowbell, hanging from the windmill. Bong! Every single person in the square, including Crowley and the momentarily triumphant Vern, flinched at the unexpected sound. Their heads snapped around, their eyes drawn instinctively toward the source of the noise. They saw Father Miguel, standing at the base of the windmill, his hand on a rope. Bong! 3 tolls, the signal of truth. And in that moment of universal distraction, with every eye in the square turned away from the stage, Sable acted. She reached into the deep inner pocket of the coat Rowan had given her. Her fingers closed around the real, original wax cylinder, the one that had been resting at the bottom of the church well. It was cool and smooth in her hand. She calmly slid it onto the phonograph's spindle. She positioned the stylus. As the last clang of the cowbell faded, and the heads of the crowd began to turn back toward her, she looked out at them, her gaze clear and steady. "Let's hear that again," she said, her voice ringing with the cold, clear authority of absolute truth, so everyone is clear. The effect was devastating. Vern Locke stared at the useless fragments at his feet, then at the identical, perfect cylinder now sitting on the machine, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending horror. He had destroyed nothing. On the platform, Mayor Pike let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. The pen, forgotten, slipped from his trembling fingers. It clattered onto the wooden planks. A small, final sound of his surrender. His wife, Martha, stepped up onto the platform. She didn't say a word. She simply walked to her husband's side and took his shaking hand in both of hers, her grip a silent anchor of strength and forgiveness. And then, a new sound intruded, the rhythmic, powerful beat of a horse's hooves, moving at a steady, deliberate canter. The crowd parted instinctively. A rider was coming through. The rider was a woman, sitting tall and straight in the saddle of a powerful bay gelding. She wore practical buckskins and a dusty, flat-brimmed hat. Pinned to her vest was a small, silver star that glinted in the harsh sunlight. A badge. She rode directly to the foot of the platform and brought her horse to a halt. Her eyes, the color of faded denim, swept the scene, taking in the shattered cylinder, the phonograph, Crowley's terrified face, and the document on the table. "Harlan Pike," she asked, her voice calm and authoritative. The mayor could only nod, speechless. "I am Deputy United States Marshal Tamsin Greer," she announced, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the square. She reached into her saddlebag and produced a folded piece of paper. "I have here a federal warrant for the investigation of one Silas Crowley on the charge of coercing a public official in the performance of his duties." She fixed her steely gaze on Crowley. "It seems I've arrived just in time for the presentation of evidence." For a long, Silent moment. The world stood still. The truth, spoken by a ghost in a box, hung in the air, absolute and undeniable. Then, the spell broke. Silas Crowley's mind, a fortress of arrogance built over decades, did not just crack, it shattered. The roaring in his ears was the sound of his kingdom collapsing, of his power turning to dust and blowing away on the afternoon breeze. He was not a man who surrendered. He was a man who broke things. And in the chaotic ruin of his mind, one single, irrational, and overwhelmingly powerful impulse took root. He had to silence that sound. Not the phonograph, the other sound, the insolent, mocking clang of that ridiculous cowbell. It was the voice of the very people he had sought to crush, and he would not, could not, suffer it. He moved. It was not a retreat. It was a desperate, scrabbling flight fueled by pure, unadulterated rage. He launched himself off the side of the platform, landing heavily in the dust. He didn't look back at the marshal, at the crowd, at the wreckage of his life. He ran, his powerful legs churning, his face a contorted mask of fury. He ran straight for the windmill. "He's going for the bell," a man in the crowd shouted. Rowan, disentangling himself from the sputtering, flower-covered Vern lock, saw it instantly. It was a final, desperate act of spite, a last attempt to smash the symbol of his defeat. "Stay here," he yelled to the marshal. And then he was off the platform, his long legs eating up the ground. But he was not alone. Sable, her heart pounding with a new, fierce adrenaline, vaulted off the platform right behind him. She gathered her skirts in one hand and ran, her feet flying over the hard-packed earth. She saw her horse, tethered nearby, and in a fluid motion born of desperation and instinct. She untied the reins and swung herself into the saddle. Rowan was fast, but a horse was faster. She galloped past him, leaning low. "Rowan, take my hand." He reached up, his powerful grip closing around her forearm, and with a surge of strength, he swung himself up behind her, landing lightly on the horse's rump. The animal grunted at the sudden double weight but did not break stride. Sable urged it on, and they closed the distance to the windmill, a strange, two-headed centaur of vengeance and justice. They galloped through a gauntlet of spiny yucca and prickly pear, the dust from their horses' hooves a billowing red cloud. Ahead of them, Crowley had already reached the windmill's ladder and was scrambling up it with the desperate agility of a cornered bear. Vern Locke, having shaken the flower from his eyes, was right behind him, his loyalty as blind and stupid as ever. Rowan slid from the back of the horse before it had even stopped, hitting the ground running. "Stay with the marshal," he ordered Sable over his shoulder as he started up the ladder. But Sable was not a woman who stayed behind. She saw the look in Rowan's eyes, the cold, deadly focus of a man heading into a fight. She slid from the saddle, grabbing the coiled lariat that hung from her pommel. She was not a roper, not like these men, but she knew how to handle a rope. High above, on the narrow, railed platform that circled the windmill's massive gearbox, the wind was a physical force. It shrieked through the spinning blades and tore at their clothes. A wild, elemental chorus to the human drama unfolding. Rowan pulled himself onto the platform just as Crowley was fumbling with the knot holding the cowbell. "It's over, Crowley," Rowan said, his voice level and calm despite the roaring wind and his heaving chest. Crowley spun around, his face a mask of madness. But before he could act, Vern Locke crested the ladder. He didn't hesitate. With a guttural roar, he lowered his shoulder and charged, shoving Rowan with all his weight. Rowan was ready for it, but the force of the blow on the narrow, vibrating platform sent him staggering backward. He stumbled, his heel catching on the edge of the platform's trapdoor. For a heart-stopping second, he teetered on the brink, the 50-foot drop to the hard-packed earth yawning below him. From the ground, Sable saw him stumble. Time seemed to slow down. She saw Vern raise a fist to strike the final, decisive blow. She didn't think, she acted. Her arm was a blur of motion. The lariat sailed through the air, a perfect, spinning loop. It wasn't aimed at Vern's neck or his body. It was aimed at his outstretched arm. The loop settled perfectly over his wrist, just as one of the massive, slowly spinning wooden blades of the windmill swept past. The rope, still in Sable's hand, snagged on the tip of the blade. The effect was immediate and brutally effective. The rope snapped taut. Vern was yanked off his feet as if by an invisible hand. His arm was wrenched violently upward, and he was slammed against the railing, the rope tethering him directly to the windmill's relentless, turning power. He let out a strangled cry of pain and shock, his arm now a prisoner of the very machine he had come to destroy, helplessly rising and falling with the blade's slow, inexorable rotation. Rowan regained his balance. He spared a single, grateful glance down at Sable, then turned his full attention to Crowley. The cattle baron had abandoned his attempts on the bell. He had pulled his pistol, a big Colt Peacemaker, and his hand was shaking, not with fear, but with an uncontrollable rage. But he didn't point it at Rowan. He pointed it at the heart of the machine itself, at the massive, greasy flywheel that transferred the power of the wind to the pump rod below. It was a final, nihilistic threat. If he was going down, he was taking it all with him. "Don't come any closer. Creed!" he screamed over the wind. "I'll shatter it. I'll break the whole damn thing." Sable, having secured her end of the lariat to a fence post, was already halfway up the ladder. She pulled herself onto the platform, her eyes blazing. Without a thought for her own safety, she stepped between Crowley's trembling pistol and the flywheel, her arms spread wide. "You'll have to go through me first," she said, her voice clear and defiant, a sliver of steel against the howling wind. Rowan raised his own pistol, but he didn't aim it at Crowley. He held it pointed at the wooden planks of the platform. His voice was calm, a quiet island in the storm of wind and emotion. "There's no more shooting. Crowley," he said, "no more breaking things, just speaking the truth." Down below, the entire town had gathered at the base of the windmill, their faces upturned, a gallery of silent witnesses. Marshal Greer pushed her way to the front, her hand resting on the butt of her own revolver. "Silas Crowley," her voice boomed. "Imbued with the full authority of the United States government, you are under arrest. Drop your weapon now." Crowley looked from the unwavering barrel of Rowan's pistol, to the defiant stance of Sable, to the silver star of the marshal below. He looked at the faces of the people he had terrorized, now staring up at him not with fear, but with a cold, unified judgment. The pistol in his hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. His shoulders slumped. The fire in his eyes died, leaving only the gray, empty ashes of defeat. His mouth worked, but only a dry, rattling sound came out. Sable took a slow step toward him. Her eyes were not filled with hatred or triumph, but with a strange, clear light. She spoke, her voice low, meant only for him, a final, quiet twisting of the knife. "They'll hear us," she whispered. It was over. The fight was won. Rowan holstered his pistol. He moved to Sable's side. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and the great wooden blades of the windmill turned slowly, majestically, above them. He reached out, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs gently brushing the dust from her cheeks. The world below the crowd, the marshal, the whimpering Vern locked tied to the blade, it all faded away. There was only the two of them, suspended between the earth and the sky, in the heart of the wind. He lowered his head and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of frantic passion or triumphant celebration. It was quiet, deep, and profound. It was a declaration made in silence, a seal placed upon a promise. It was a kiss that spoke of sandstorms and whispered confessions, of shared danger and a future they had fought for and won. It was a claim, a planting of a flag, a statement to the world and to each other that here, on this wild and unforgiving land, they had found their home. Down below, the sound of the cowbell, pushed by the wind, let out a single, clear clang. The kiss, so private in its intimacy, became a public signal. The truth had not only been spoken, it had been seen, it had been felt. A ripple went through the crowd, and then a single person began to clap, then another and another, until the entire square erupted in a wave of thunderous applause. They were not cheering for a spectacle. They were cheering for the simple, beautiful, and long overdue blooming of justice. Marshall Greer, a professional to the last, waited for the kiss to end. Then she started up the ladder. She cuffed a suddenly weeping Vern Locke, freeing him from his humiliating bondage. And then she put the irons on Silas Crowley, who offered no resistance at all. He was a hollow man, the wind knocked out of him for good. As the marshal led her prisoners down, the great windmill, as if sensing the end of the conflict, seemed to sigh. The wind died down for a moment, and the great wooden blades slowed their rotation, turning, and then, with a final, gentle creak, coming to a complete stop. The descent from the windmill platform was a return to a world remade. Rowan and Sable came down the ladder not into a town of fear and doubt, but into a community that had just witnessed its own rebirth. The applause had subsided, replaced by a profound, watchful silence as Marshal Tamsin Greer led a hollow-eyed Silas Crowley and a blubbering Vern Locke toward the town jail. The crowd parted for them, not with fear, but with a cold, silent contempt. The only sound was the rhythmic, metallic clink-clank of the handcuffs, a crisp, final percussion marking the end of a long and terrible song. It was the rhythm of justice. All eyes then turned to the platform where the story had reached its crescendo. Mayor Harlan Pike, his face streaked with tears of shame and relief, stood before the small table. His hands, which had trembled so violently just moments before, were now strangely steady. He picked up the contract he had been about to sign, the document that would have sold his town's soul. He held it up for all to see. This was a mistake, he said, his voice thick but clear. A mistake born of weakness and fear, and it ends now. With a slow, deliberate motion, he tore the contract in half. The sound of the ripping paper was shockingly loud in the quiet square, a sound of finality, of a chain being broken. He did not stop there. He tore the two halves into quarters, and the quarters into eighths, until all that remained was a handful of meaningless scraps. He let them fall from his fingers, and they scattered on the wind like bitter confetti. He then took a fresh sheet of paper and a new pen. His first act as a man redeemed was to draft a short, simple proclamation, his script firm and clear. He recognized Sable Heart's validated claim to the land and water of Coyote Draw Spring. His second act was to take another sheet and formally ratify the charter for the newly formed Mesquite Water Cooperative, granting it the right to build and maintain the flumes and troughs that would bring water to the entire community. He signed both documents with a flourish, his signature no longer the mark of a puppet, but of a leader. As he signed, another symbolic act was taking place on the edge of the square. Jules Mercado, his work now complete and validated, walked to the corner of the churchyard that marked the final boundary point of his survey. He lifted a heavy wooden mallet and drove the final survey stake, a sturdy post of ironwood, deep into the earth. The sound of the mallet striking the post was a steady, rhythmic beat, a sound of construction, of permanence. He then tacked his map, the beautiful, precise rendering of the land's true lines, to the post for all to see, the red wax seal of the territory, bright and pristine, shone like a beacon in the afternoon sun. The small ranchers, the men who had toiled through the night in Ocotillo Rock Pass, let out a collective breath, one by one. They removed their hats, holding them to their chests in a gesture of profound, silent respect. Their gamble had paid off. Their future was their own again. The women of the town, led by Etta Byrne, surged toward the platform. They did not cheer or shout. Their emotion was too deep, too long suppressed for such a display. They surrounded Sable, their work-worn hands touching her arm, her shoulder. Mrs. Byrne gripped her hand. her old eyes shining with unshed tears. "We heard you, child," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The other women echoed her, their voices a soft, powerful chorus. "We heard you." It was the most beautiful sound Sable had ever heard. Rowan had been standing back, a silent guardian watching the pieces fall into their rightful place. Now, he came to her side. The crowd, sensing the need for a private moment, drew back slightly, giving them a small island of quiet in the sea of people. He looked down at her. His face, usually a mask of stoic control, was open, transformed by a pride and admiration so profound it took her breath away. "You did it, Sable," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur meant only for her. "You made the whole valley listen." Sable looked up at him, at this solitary man who had stepped out of the shadows and stood with her against the world. She saw the healed wounds in his eyes, the quiet strength that had been her anchor. She reached up and placed her hand on his cheek. "No, Rowan," she whispered, and then she rose on her toes, pressing her forehead against his. "We did." Her gaze fell upon the phonograph, still sitting on the edge of the platform. The real wax cylinder, the one that held Crowley's confession, was still on the spindle, the needle still resting in its final groove. It was the weapon that had won the war, the ghost that had spoken the truth. The story it had to tell was over. She reached out and, with a single, decisive click, she stopped the crank. The soft whirring ceased. The machine fell silent. She had closed the loop, ending the story with the very instrument that had given it a voice. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. They stood together on the wooden platform, the undisputed center of their new world. A gentle breeze, the first breath of a peaceful evening, swept across the square, lifting a strand of her dark hair and the hem of her dusty skirt. From its perch on the windmill, the cowbell, moved by the same breeze, let out a single, long, resonant note that hung in the clear desert air. The crowd, seeing them standing there, hand in hand, the silent phonograph beside them, finally let their emotion loose in a great, heartfelt roar of approval. A man in the front row with a large, boxy camera lifted it, and a brilliant flash of magnesium powder lit the scene, capturing the moment for all time. Rowan looked down at Sable, a slow, easy smile spreading across his face, and in front of the entire town, under the wide-open sky of the land they had saved. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not the searching, gentle kiss of the sandstorm, nor the profound, declarative kiss on the windmill. This one was different. It was shorter, surer, a kiss of absolute certainty. It was the kiss of a beginning. It was the kiss of home. The image locks in place. Arrested by the flash, two faces joined in a kiss, smiles just beginning to unfurl. Beside them, the quiet phonograph and its cherished wax cylinder, an artifact of a struggle settled. Proof of a truth no longer disputable. The reckoning is finished. The triumph is complete. No coda is needed. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and consider giving it an extra boost by hitting the hype button. Your support helps these stories be heard by more people.